All right, so let us turn to the text, turn to our larger discussion. I just wanted to remind you, last time I made some introductory comments about the larger goal of the course, which is to present Job and the hermeneutical theology of Job in the larger context of renewing theology as such. That is to say, we wanted to kind of explore through the particular example of one text how a particular individual goes through a primary crisis, personal experience, and rebuilds a theological world, or a world of reason, or a world of theological reason, or a world of meaning, once again out of the primary experience. So we were saying we're not going to try to work from the book of Job and then move to abstract issues of theology. We're not going to go from abstract theology back to Job, but we want to really explore how a text starts with primary experience and then moves to theological language, and the relationship between primary experience and theological language. Just as part of my own particular project in all of this is to renew theology by trying to reground it in primary experiences and primary metaphors, and not to come to it through more abstract symbols, abstract formulations, and then struggle to see whether that matches up in any way with experience. But the renewal has to start in a primary way, and that primary way, as I indicated, returns us to the anthropological ground of what it means to have a body, to lose friends, to lose things, and to rebuild a world. Obviously, it's also a sample of one. So while the book is a book about tradition and crisis in the larger sense, it is a particular model of one particular individual, and whether the model of that one person can stand for a larger community, and the experience of one person is enough to undermine or reset a larger theological issue, something that we want to consider. I'll come back later in today's class to the very beautiful and powerful essay, I hope you agree, by Kierkegaard, which is his discourses from 1843. And I think in part as a solitary individual, in part as kind of a pre-existentialist existentialist, he says we learn from this not because Job, in a sense, teaches a doctrine, but that Job enacts a life. And when we read the text, we are able to get comfort of how a life endures suffering. And it's not necessarily that we have to buy into the doctrine, but we have a solitary person facing solitary suffering, and we read that in the sense that, let us say, it's endurable, or there's a way to struggle with it. So from his particular point of view, we wouldn't want to read it if he was just a preacher, if he was just doing theological claptrap, and this is what it is, and that's what it is, and so on and so forth. But because we see him in a kind of authentic heroic pose, not simply as a person of faith, but as a person who opens himself, I use the masculine, but Job as the person who opens mind and soul to the suffering in his first sense, and doesn't collapse into the abyss. We'll come back to Kierkegaard's understanding, but one of the great things he feels is that he opens his heart to a much larger sense of the suffering, rather than falling into the abyss of loss. And that becomes a certain kind of paradigm. So even for Kierkegaard too, the power of the person who is struck in a very primary way is a core issue. All right. Now what I would like to do as a way of our starting today, because the course is dealing with biblical hermeneutics and the relationship between, I would say, its language and its transformations and philosophical theology. Before we actually go directly to the text, I want to make a couple of larger hermeneutical observations about reading, and reading a particular kind of text. And then I'd like you, if you need to, please jump in. But I want to kind of set this as a kind of tone. So the first larger category we say is, how do you enter the text? How does one enter this text? So in classical interpretive terms, we say you enter into the hermeneutical circle. Right? Entering the hermeneutical circle means one has to find a wedge or an entry point into the language of the text. You have to begin and enter, and you may begin and enter with a certain personal presupposition. Obviously, a certain contemporary mental presupposition. You may try to suspend it or subject it to the language of the text as fast as possible. But you start outside the text in your particular subjective universe. The text is its own universe. The question is, how do you enter into the universe of the text, which has its own, using Steiner's term, real presence, coming into it with your real presence? Part of which you could suspend, part of it you don't want to suspend because you want to learn from it as well, you want to struggle. And part of it, you have to find out what the key terms of the language of that text is as you enter. So it's not simply that I'm always going to read the text, let us say, in Gadameryan terms, I'm always going to make it a modern reading because I can never suspend or bracket my contemporary situation. But one of the fictive presuppositions of reading is that the text takes you into its world. And if you're able to suspend, let us say, your covenantal or Jewish or Christian or other background as much as possible, you're going to allow that text to mold its truth in relationship to your reading, hopefully a reading that will be grounded in the text. So you move from the self and the self's world, which is, again, a primary personal experience, into the narrative world of the text. And to use a famous phrase, there would be a willing suspension of disbelief. A willing suspension of disbelief because you want to allow the narrative world of the text to make a claim upon you. So if I started reading Job, and I said, oh, this is silly. It's a folk narrative. What does it mean? How can it make a claim upon me? It's talking about God in heaven and a Satan who goes around. The best translation of a Satan is a kind of a provocateur. He's a kind of inciter. That would be the best literal translation. That doesn't make any sense to me. But then you're already pulling back from the way the text is establishing its own truth and narrative claims. All right? So there is, in a certain sense, a willing suspension of disbelief so that the text can instruct or reinscribe itself upon your consciousness. You might do it differently, another author may do it differently, but entering that hermeneutical circle takes that risk. It means at the same time, when we talk about the hermeneutical circle, is that meaning is an accumulated and complicated process. I think I know what the text is saying with the first word. In the second word, they build on it, but it may contradict it. So the meaning of the text is both of those two things simultaneously as I'm moving into the text. And then I have a sentence, and then I have another sentence, and I have a paragraph. And my meaning is accumulating, and I'm revising. So the meaning of the text is not just where I got at the very end. The meaning is already an accumulated process of meaning as I'm undergoing the experience of what is taking place in the text. How this is happening to Job, who is making this happen, how the narrator does it. Now, in that context, and we'll talk about that more, but you can see already that when we say what is the meaning of the book of Job, the meaning of the book of Job is a complex unfolding of accumulated senses that is not independent of you as the reader who is constantly re-engaging the hermeneutical circle and, as the GPS says, recalculating. Constantly recalculating. Hopefully in a voice that you can listen to. Recalculating. All right. Different cultures have different voices. You can listen to certain kinds of people and not to others. But anyway. Now, as we're going to anticipate coming to the prose narrative, and I want to come back to what Newsome has said. One of the features of that initial narrative, or that initial text, is that it is narrative. Which is to say, the syntax, this is still related to the issue of the hermeneutical circle, the syntax has a certain kind of ratio. It has a certain kind of rationality or reasonability. When I'm reading a text, I assume it's going to make some kind of cultural or mental logic. Unless the text breaks down, or there is a real crisis, and so on, or if a voice comes in and interjects into the narrative and disrupts it. So from a certain point of view, subjecting the reading self to the world of narrative is subjecting yourself as well to the deep logic of the unfolding of narrative. It's in that sense that people, or maybe not only in that sense, but that's the way I would like to understand what people could or may mean when they talk about narrative ethics. Right? It's not just that the text is communicating ethics. That would be a trivial way of understanding it. But the form of narrative is a way of understanding being in the world with the self in relationship to many other things. It's establishing an ethical or moral disposition. So entering the hermeneutical circle in part might mean that I have to suspend the normal way that I really read the world as a crazy place in 2013 and try to enter into what appears to be a fictive simplicity, which is really very sophisticated, but it's a fictive simplicity to sharpen the aporia, or the gaps of meaning that are going to unfold. Now, there couldn't be anything more disruptive than the point that I enter into what seems to be a simple world and then crisis happens. And it constantly deepens and deepens, so that as we move to chapter 3 and the poetry, a different type of language unfolds that tries to stutter steps and different forms of rhetoric to recalculate, to kind of get yourself back into, can you ever re-embed that Job with that new language back into the old Job? It's going to be impossible. And even the God who will speak at the end won't speak the way God speaks at the end. So everything will be changing, but as we are readers, we want to be mindful and sensitive to that. So let me make one more question, then people want to come in before we move to the next point. So when we're reading scripture, let's say we can't not know that we're reading a book from Hebrew scriptures. part of the issue would be when you enter the hermeneutical circle is to say to yourself, do I need to know anything for this to work theologically and to teach me? Now you could say, as we may want to say, you need to know that he is dueling with Deuteronomy. Right? Deuteronomy says in chapter 11, for example, if you obey my commandments, I will give you rain in its season. If you don't obey my commandments, I'll stick it to you. Right? I'll block it all up, and the world will be a real desolate place. Because I, God, see what's going on. And there's reward, and there's punishment, and there's consequence. And there's some commensurability between action and consequence. Do I really need to know that when I read chapters 1 and 2? Is there a way that text will attack my mind as a universal statement? And there's enough there that doesn't require me to read it in terms of the whole hermeneutical background of the covenant, even if that is my template, and that's what might make it even more charged. But Job is a universal figure. He doesn't come from the land of Israel. He comes from the land of Oz. He comes from Uz, right? The land of Oz. That means he comes from Nebraska. Job, the man from Nebraska. Didn't get a football scholarship. What am I going to do? I'll go pick corn. Anyway. But Uz is part of the genealogy of Aram, so it's in the northwest Semitic sphere, and his friends are people from the east. In other words, they represent figures of wisdom, figures of the world. It's a universe. It's some. So the narrator from the get-go doesn't say you have to have the saw you at Sinai. That's a kind of a website for Jewish dating. So I saw you at Sinai. So you don't have to say saw you at. You have to say saw you at Sinai in order to read the book of Job, right? That's a big difference, right? I just have to be a person who cares about what it means to live a meaningful religious life in relationship to God, and then there is a crisis, right? And the text will explore, as we'll see shortly, the nature of motivation and the nature of subjectivity. We have all that. We don't. Okay. So before I move to the next point, anybody have any questions or any observations about anything that I have been trying to say? Talking about the hermeneutical circle, accumulation of meaning, trying to subject your consciousness to a narrative form for the sake of learning the text, right? Now, obviously, even within that, there is the pole of the reader who will be slightly resistant. So there's already a little push-pull, which we would consider to be part of the hermeneutical issues. And of course, the biblical hermeneutics means that it's going to work itself out in the concrete terms of biblical language. right? It's not going to talk, it's not going to do Greek, and it's not going to do any other kind of thing. It's going to do Hebrew, and the way Hebrew would formulate it, right? And one would read it from that point of view. Now, anybody want to pick up on anything that just occurs to you at this point? All right. So the second, I have three. The second thing is I've already been hinting at this, but it relates to this narrative. That we enter a narrative that has a mythic and folk simplicity. That is going to address itself to the most intractable question. What do you do with suffering? I pose it that way very deliberately. What do you do with your suffering? You blame God, you blame yourself, you blame the tradition. There's nobody to blame. What do you do? Do you have any expectations from your life that make suffering take on a certain character? And can you suspend that for the sake of this narrative? Maybe yes, maybe no. So when we have a simple situation, it's simple because the presenting situation is this Job who is an obsessive-compulsive religious personality, we'll see. And all of a sudden, someone is trying to pull the thread out of the whole thing. Right? The Satan comes, so does a person really serve God for no purpose? Hachinam, for no reason? That's already the question that's going to unfold. Because in a culture based on obedience and performance, can you do the good because it's good? Can you serve God because God said? Or do you do it to maintain meaning, wealth, friendship, status, keep your head together, whatever you do, all the games that we play. So that's going to undermine the simplicity with one simple provocative question that we're going to get into. It's also not simply some simple scenes on earth, it's a scene in heaven that's absolutely outrageous. It's outrageous that a servant of God would test God. Not just that God allows the Satan to test a person. So I want you to feel the outrageousness. God is provoked into something that God doesn't know, presumably. It's not an omniscient God yet, or maybe at all. And the provocation means that God allows innocent suffering. It's outrageous from that point of view of Scripture. God permits innocent death and destruction for God's ego. I got a great guy in the dugout, the fish. Yes, that's one last night. Just think about that. From what's going on earth, what's going on in heaven. So there's a kind of two levels of consciousness. Well, actually, and then really three levels of consciousness. So there's the level, and I'm just going to say it now because we're going to come back to this when we look at the text, but we're still talking about entering into that hermeneutical circle. So there's that first level of consciousness, which is Job's consciousness, when he's just doing his Job thing. Love God, love my rituals, love my family. I'm gonna really show people how to do it. I'm a paradigm, right? And then there is this insane scene in heaven of a God who's provoked to kill, maim, and destroy, so that God can show he's got the best guy on the face of the earth. Right? And those two things, in a certain sense, are standing in a kind of stark juxtaposition. And then there's a third consciousness, which is you and me, the reader. Because we know what Job doesn't know. From the very beginning, we know what Job doesn't know. This is an insane event. Why does the narrator write like that? In this simple way. So from the very beginning, you and I, as readers, have a privileged consciousness. And there's another moral and theological vector that we bring to the reading. Which includes irony. Right? So within the very quote, simplified, apparently simplistic narrative, there's something crazy at the theological level. And there's something ironic that we're watching this going on. It's, I think, not for nothing. In the 30s and 40s, there was a very interesting literary critic in Israel called Baruch Kurzweil. It's not known because he didn't write in any language that most people read. But he asked a very interesting question related to the book of Job. And I'm just going to throw it out at this point for you to think about, related to what we're talking about. He asked the question, is the book of Job a tragedy? Because it's the book that comes closest to tragedy, in the sense, from an biblical point of view, that we don't have one sovereign, supreme God. We have something else that can unravel a divine consciousness and change things. So in this strange mythic scenario, there's something, it's not tragedy obviously, but I'm using the term because you see what border it's pushing. It's pushing the fact that things can unravel even against God's sovereign will. Well, there is no sovereign will. Right? Perhaps. But that, so we have this third vector, and what we know through the agency of the narrator. So now we talked a little bit about hermeneutical circles, a little bit about the narrative ethic, and a little bit about the simplicity and the different levels of textual and readerly consciousness. Okay? To which you and I have to submit somewhat for this text to make a claim upon us as a text. In part, and we'll see more, that's part of what I think Newsome is getting at, which I thought polyphonic texts, etc., building on Bakhtin. Right? We're constantly shifting vectors of speech, orientation, style of narrative, so that we are required to be holding multiple forms of thought simultaneously in mind. And that's part of the instruction of the text. So now, anybody want to say anything at this point before I move on to the critical? Any challenge, thought, query? All right, I'll give you a little time to wake up. Yeah. Yeah.
Job, from the time when Job was written.
Nice and loud as we have our Moscow friend here.
Oh, so from the time when Job was written, can it be, I mean, it's a technical question, can it be read as a reaction, let's say, to a culture, to a Jewish culture? Or
I'm going to come back to that in a second. Well, that would be the notion that I was implying. The question is, you have to read it in reaction to a culture. So in part, I was hinting at that. Do you have to stand at Sinai and know the covenant for this to work? So, Martin Buber, in his book Prophetic Faith, has some comments about Job, and he answers Adrian's question by saying it's a response to the destruction of the temple. So Buber is trying to find a cultural context for something that I think transcends any particular historical moment. Obviously, there are going to be trigger points. Now, if I would also, I hadn't thought of this in this way, and this I think will dovetail with where I want to go for my third point, but I hadn't thought of it in just this way. So let me reformulate this thank you for the question. There are moments in culture which undergo radical transformations. Okay? Kind of pivot points in culture that Jaspers talked about. Right? And one of the pivot points in culture that seems to begin in the 5th century, and I'm going to slide Job under the wire here, because I think it's probably at least from around that period. We have Plato, we have Confucius, we have Lao Tse, we have all kinds of stuff going on in the 5th and the 4th century, which are reflecting a certain crisis in culture and the birth of forms of subjectivity. Something is happening at this tipping point, cross-culturally in some astonishing way. And Job is part of this from a biblical point of view. Or you have tragedy too, right? All of which are exploring what do you do when the old order breaks down. We're doing that now, that's the task of this course. Now, What do you do when the old order breaks down? What are the resources? And you just can't do a spin on the old. But you've got to really recalculate. Take some right and left turns, or maybe not at all. Put the car aside and say, I'm going to put on boost. Same thing, same period. Okay, all of this. Put down the Buddha. Let me say one more point and we'll come back. So, what do I mean by this? Part of the crisis, even in classical Greek, we would say that the Iliad might, some of this later material might be from the 7th to 8th century. What am I trying to get at? What I'm trying to state is that some cultures have the daring and the capacity to produce texts that explore the boundary in the most radical way possible. They take their culture to the brink. And they become classics in part for that very reason. So I just alluded a second ago to the Iliad. So think about it. It's taking all the heroic values of ancient Greece to the boundary. What is the relationship between a hero who is willing to live a short life and die for virtue? Is it worth it? Is it worth it in relationship to the chaos that's produced? Is it worth it in relationship to all the death and destruction and the loss of friendship and ego and craziness and suspension of rationality? So the whole Iliad is exploring that boundary. It's a classic that takes you to the brink of everything that the culture thought had value. And said, is it worth it? Does it make sense? Then the culture has to kind of recalibrate the tragedy or other forms in which all those traditions are taken up. And they become classics on their own right because they become a noble statement of response. The issue's not the truth, but it works. It seems to work for something. So my third point about Job, which I've been backing into Adrian's question, is that it too explores the boundary. It's a cultural boundary that will be explored in the most universal terms. The cultural boundary is a boundary that is, in a certain sense, formed by a biblically based religious covenantal consciousness, which is to say, obedience to the divine will is paramount. And it asks the question, why does a person do it? Why does a person, what is the nature of action? Is action pure? And in that process, so it's asking the question of motivation. So that's the key question that's underlying this culture. Why do you do that? Just obedience? Why do you do that? And then it explores the issue of subjectivity. It pushes the cultural self to begin to talk in I language. And it raises that I voice to the tip of the pyramid. So part of what we were trying to say is that voice, what can you do with a sample of one? Well, a hell of a lot. Because the whole text will use a sample of one as a text. Right? Maybe you can't say a lot about the sample of one of you and me and your friend. But the fictive structure of a narrative is that it's a universal type. Right? It's using the sample of one to make a paradigmatic state. Or explore through that. So let's take a few minutes just to talk. We talked about three things: hermeneutical circles, narrative, ethics, and this question of text. Yeah.
I have a question about reading practices.
Nice enough, everybody here.
I have a question about reading practices, which I take to be related to Adrian's question. So everything that you said about universality is well taken, but I'm wondering to what extent it would be fruitful to historicize Jewish reading practices and think about the ideology of reading within the life world of Job's original moment. So in Newsome's book, we have all of these different ideologies of reading. A hermeneutics of friendship, a hermeneutics of seduction, a hermeneutics of hospitality, and then we have this hermeneutics of the face, right? So a text is a face that you encounter, which she takes from Levinas. And as I was reading this, I found it fascinating and I loved it, but at the same time, I couldn't help but think, this is an ideology of reading, which is a recent historical innovation, which is to say it's directly related to the bourgeois public sphere and a print culture that arose in the 18th century, where people could come to see print as a way of intimacy circulating among strangers. And I imagine that the ideology of reading that obtained in Job's life world was very different. And so I sort of felt like Newsome wasn't historicizing her own position as a reader. And I guess the question that I'm asking, which I take to be related to Adrian's, is what Jewish ideologies of reading might be helpful to think about as we're wrestling with what are the sort of claims that this text is placing on me as a reader.
You're raising a lot of very powerful issues. And it goes back to the very first issues I was talking about this entering the hermeneutical circle. One thing we're definitely not doing is doing Jewish reading practices. We're definitely not doing Jewish reading practices. Because then we would have to start and say, what was the reading of Job in the apocryphal testament of Job, which only knows the folk tale, doesn't have the argument? It's a little bit closer in that sense to the epistle of James, which says the patient Job. The patient Job is just talking about the folk tale at the beginning and the end, not Job the rebel. So there clearly was some narrative floating around in one form of Jewish antiquity that was just Job the patient. He accepts and he goes on. Very different from suffering heroes from Mesopotamian texts. So I have a little bit of problem with why she brings in some of that Babylonian theodicy stuff. I didn't understand why she does it, but so there are multiple practices, and then of course there will be hints in the earliest midrashic literature which will try to explore in an inner Jewish reading suffering and whether one can suffer for love. That's exactly the term that's used. And then a whole series of other reading practices. We're at a point in this narrative which is complicating that. One of the reading practices that the text wants to create its own accountability through its own textuality. I'll try to come back to the issue that you're raising slowly. But the text is trying to create its own accountability by getting you reading into the text. Now, to the degree to which Jewish reading practices are expressed in the text, they are reflective of the way the Friends will parse the tradition. That is to say, the Friends have a series. We don't know what text exactly they have, although as the text will unfold, they will be citing one another and quoting one another. So we will get at this question of some reading practices by the way they try to cite one another. Or I will try to get at that question already from chapter 3 when we see that there may be for a tuned Jewish reader would pick up the allusions to other biblical texts. So we're creating an intertextual undercurrent. So as the Friends are parsing the world, they're reading the world with a Jewish reading, a Jewish or a late biblical form of reading that world. They are helping you understand the complexity of trying to think. The forms, the way I want to try to get at your question, is not just a hermeneutical question. It's the way the narrative form or the form of rhetoric and argument either helps or frustrates thinking. Right? And part of that, I think, will be thematized in the book of Job. How much can you think when you think in a certain way? It's a very serious question. Do your cultural and logical and hermeneutical parameters put you in a straitjacket? You sort of hobble forward because you say, these are the only legs that are going to carry me. Well, I'm afraid to grow a new leg. Now so that's the first statement. Now let me try to at least come on the bias to what you, I think, we're really asking. And that is, can Newsome help us? Can she help? Can the language of Bakhtin help? Can this post-18th, 19th century culture of reading help? Can Levinas's notion of a phase help in relationship to what a text surface is? Now, one possible way of approaching your issue would be to return us to the very beginning of the hour when we talked about the hermeneutical circle. I can't completely suspend the mind that I bring into the text. But I want to do one thing. There's a term that the Russian formalists use. this translation is to strangify. I think the Russian term is Austriani or something like that. But it says strangification. What do they mean by that? You have to make the text a little bit odd, or use a term that gets you out of your mind warp. So all I would really try to say, and I want to have people jump in, I'm not sure you can swallow all the stuff that Newsome wants you to drink, and sometimes you feel like gagging with a lot of terms. But it makes you kind of re-engage with another language. And it has one benefit. The one benefit is that it is not using the language of Judaism and Christianity. That would be a disaster. Because then we would really have entered a different hermeneutical circle. Now that may be what people in Jewish Christian cultures want to do and will do, and save the text and save their soul at the same time. But if the task, or one task, is to say, what is this book of Job saying? And are there categories that help me think differently about the experience, the way a text makes an appearance as face? What is the appearance of the text? How do I read its contours? Right? But we're also making choices, the same way when you try to read another person's face. So I guess for me, part of that is a heuristic, right? It's a heuristic. I do it to help me move forward. My goal is much greater than Carol Newsome's book. My goal is the book of Job and my soul. And I'm trying to solve a problem through the book of Job. And I'm reading it not to pass an exam, I'm reading it to help me think. So these kind of questions become important as one, if you keep this larger goal. So I think that there are kinds of reading that would inhibit the process and kinds of reading that doesn't. So I think, let me just make one more spin on this. I think there may be very contemporary reasons why she takes a big bite of Bakhtin's apple, dialogism and so on and so forth. But she may have done for his own particular reasons. But I think as a modern, she's trying to get at the notion of the multiple perspectives of moral reason. That's a very modern kind of initiative. Now that may not be the truth of the book of Job, but it's a damn good thing to be thinking about. Because one is helped by the different voices to keep rotating your mind. in ways that you wouldn't rotate your mind if you were left on your own. And so the Bhaktin prod is to say, so let me give Eliphaz a shot. Let me get Bildad to shoot a go. Does he have? No. So I keep moving in a moral carousel, right? As I'm trying to make sense of this text. So in part, that's maybe provoked by very, very modern considerations. But that's okay. Because I might not have done this otherwise. And I would also say, that one of the things that the book of Job provokes you to realize is that thinking about truth is perspectival. The characters are representing perspectives. You can't get your head around God's head. You're always at an angle. And the end of the book will slam you on the head with that. Your mind can't take in God's mind because you're thinking within it, as it were. So what do you do on the inside? And how do you think in an authentic, faithful manner on the inside of a comprehensive totality which you can never stand outside of. So in a certain sense, that outsideness is that outsideness that we're invited into with the prologue. Something very big, presented in a folk narrative of Scene in Heaven. But it's trying to say that there's something going on that all the people on the earth have no idea about. Right? They have no clue what's really going on. See? So all of a sudden, suffering happens, and it sends some kind of a light of consciousness into the world. What can you see with that light? What does suffering allow you to see in the darkness? Or nothing? Is it a false consciousness or a true consciousness? But I have to think about that a lot. And I have no idea what the answer is. And it keeps changing more. But the book of Job is relentless in trying to make you aware of multiple grounds of people trying to be honest. The friends are not jerks. They're trying to be honest too. They're trying to have integrity too. Okay? And so you're asked through these multiple faces The faces of the characters are the face of the text. In some that only makes sense, right? And you're being asked to think about the face of meaning to the face of voice. The face of meaning of the whole problem to the facets, the faces, the facets of the voices that are moving. So perhaps slightly from that point of view, this lingo of Bakhtin and Levinas is helpful. I'm not going to become a Levinasian through this, necessarily, or Bakhtinian, or any of those things. But I'm helped. You had a question?
So you were talking earlier about Job exploring a boundary.
About?
The Job exploring a boundary.
Yeah.
And you had used a word about God, the sovereign, about God being sovereign. This is a while ago now.
Yeah. I probably don't agree with myself anyway. Next question.
And I wonder, I guess my question is, what is the boundary in terms of that word? What did you mean by that? And what boundary is Job's? Does sovereignty mean that God is the only agent, and so by virtue of there being this other agent in heaven, that means that God doesn't have sovereignty? Or are we talking about Job's agency, or is sovereignty a question of agency? What is?
So the way I was using it.
Yeah.
Or I think I intended it. I was using it in the context of talking about the potential tragedy.
Okay.
Right? So we have to keep that on the table. I wasn't just talking about sovereignty in abstract.
Sure.
So what I was trying to open up in the discussion was that a sovereign God would not need to prove anything to his minions. A sovereign God would know that Job served God in a certain kind of a way. A sovereign God wouldn't be duped into an ego game. A sovereign God would be sovereign. And he wouldn't need little assistants to run around the earth and bring back a report. That, by the way, the terms that are used the late bars to go back and forth also appears, the Hebrew phrase appears in the book of Zechariah, and we now know the same terms. They were part of the Persian secret police of those days. They had little agents going back and forth in the streets, checking it out and bringing the word back to the mullahs. So it's a very technical. So these are God's agents. Should I give Job the shaft or give him some ice cream cone? I don't know. Go down there and see what he's doing and see whether he deserves to be shafted or get an ice cream cone. I got better things to do. I am God. You're Satan. You do your job, I'll do my job. Okay, God, I'll go, I'll check it out, I'll bring you back something. I saw it. This is what I saw. I'll bring you back my report. So, if from that point of sovereignty, you wouldn't need, they're filling in this personality profile of the Job. Coming back, he does it for this. So he's a kind of good guy. let's give him a few more camels. He's a kind of a nerdy guy. Let's see whether, he does 3 more prostrations, maybe we'll give him a half a camel. Right? But it's doing it in these kind of simple terms, but they're very serious terms. Right? But a sovereign God couldn't be provoked into that. So it's a God who is not completely removed, not Upios, he's not Gonzo, never had access, way transcendent. He's somewhere in this middle ground. Not inaccessible utterly, the way Kafka presents it in the trial. You can't even get your way into the court. It's way, you don't even know if he's there, and then maybe sleeping, for all you know. Probably God's having a senile snooze in the middle of the afternoon. Yeah.
I'm a little bit confused about the word provocation. When I read those first 2 chapters in translation, it did not look like God was like angry about anything. It didn't seem like he
The
wanted
name
to prove
Satan,
something.
the name Satan, in Hebrew, it's called Hasatan. So they're actually mythicizing this agent provocateur. He is the Satan, the provocateur. The word Satan in Hebrew, Satan, means to push a person aside, or to make some kind of a thing. So it's not God, but it's the Satan who will introduce it. It's the term for the Satan. A couple of other things, then I want to turn to the text. We okay? We're good? Can we go on? Do it? Okay, good. All right. So let's then do, so we stand, of course, if you need to get up and do what you need to do. Otherwise, all right, let's go to the text. And does anybody want to raise anything else about this? I'm going to come back to some of these other issues also for the Kierkegaard going to come to the report. But is there anything else that is on your mind that you want to kind of raise, or at least you want me to be aware that's in your head? Yeah.
I have a problem with a sovereign God who causes everything to happen, but doesn't seem to assume full responsibility for it.
Okay. That is a problem in this. It's a problem. Yeah, you're right. It's a problem. So it's but it's setting it up to get your hackles. It's setting it up, right? So you have to also be aware that the theological setup is also just that. It's a theological setup. There's no pure ground of starting theology. You don't start from some kind of a pure ground. You have to start from some narrative or ideological context. You think over against that ground. Right? So that is part of the thing that we're struggling with. You have to know the covenantal context. You have to be a believer. You have to be an Israelite. You have to be a lapsed Jew or Christian. Right? Does it help to be lapsed? Or does it hurt more if you're not lapsed? Job wasn't lapsed. So it hurts a lot. Or at least it will come to hurt. have to explore the nature of these primary responses. That's what we're going to get to right now until we get to chapter 3, which will flip us on our heads next week. So, let's begin. I can't read the whole thing always, but let's begin by looking at the text. And I'm going to just have anybody with whatever translation, would someone like to just begin reading? Let's just begin with the first 5 lines. So we can kind of, we're going to begin to look at a number of things and begin by exemplifying the stuff that we talked about from the opening hermeneutical considerations. So who'd like to read in English? Okay, great. Nice and loud, because you are bringing us into the text. Follow his voice and his tones. Throw apples. Huh? No, okay, no. You're too nice to throw apples. All right.
There
The lady will not throw an apple. She just back down.
I
She just back down. You back down. You're a sweetheart. You won't throw an apple. What?
I just said no pressure because he's blushing.
You are too. Okay. Okay, go ahead.
Here we go. There was a man in the land of Uz named Job. That man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. His possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 5,000 yoke of oxen, and 500 she-asses.
I think you said 500, not 5,000. Liar.
500, yeah.
He's sneaking something.
And a very large household. That man was wealthier than anyone in the East.
Go on, 2 more lines.
It was the custom of his sons to hold feasts, each on his set day, in his own home. They would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When a round of feast days was over, Job would send word to them to sanctify themselves, and rising early in the morning, he would make burnt offerings, 1 for each of them. For Job thought, perhaps my children have sinned and blasphemed God in their thoughts. This is what Job always used to do.
So, how do we enter this text? Anybody want to? What leaps at you here? I want to hear how you're thinking about this. Just things that you're seeing. Just fragments of thoughts. Help me. Yep.
Job seems to have a dependent relationship with his drunk children.
He is dependent on them? or they-
He feels the need to take care of them religiously.
Okay, all right, okay. Doesn't trust what he talks about. Okay, a lot of parents feel that way. Okay.
It's very ordered and routine oriented.
Okay, there's some kind of patterning. It's not just a one-time thing. Ritual is deeply embedded in the structure of Job's life. So it's in his body and in his head. Right? Yeah.
A few things that jump out to me. His wealth is very spelled out. His wealth is very spelled out, so we know to the extent that he is wealthy. And
why do we want to know that? Why do you think of all the things that's stated after?
I guess it'll come to show how great of a loss he ends up having. It's also interesting to me that he's both really wealthy and morally upright, and I guess those are things that a lot of us aspire to, and so he's, I guess, sort of the atypical person in that sense.
Kind of a paradigm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
His wealth probably indicates God's favor.
Yeah, well, we don't yet know that, but we will come to understand that he gets to that because God has given that to him, or does he believe he's a good Puritan and he got that because he works hard and he has good thoughts and he serves God well, and so God has rewarded him, right? So we have a couple of these issues. We don't really have to know what the name Job means, but even a person with a little Hebrew might sense that Eo, the name Eo, hints at Oyeh, he's the enemy of God. Right? There's something there. His name is not so simple. So, he's a person. He is contextualized on the earth, the land of Uz, right? He lives on the earth. He has a name. So he's not just an Ish. It says that's how we get Ish Haya. Once upon a time there was a man. But this man has a name. And this man lives on the ground. And he has virtues. And he has a family. So he's not just a universal, he's a very particular person. He's called Job. You can email him. Job.com. Right? If you use another name, you won't get Job. Having a name is a theological, it's a very particular thing to have a name. I don't say, hey you. I use your name, then we have a different relationship. And I don't call him Mr. Job. He's Job. Right? So it's already a way that he's particularized as person. And we're trying to get at the hermeneutics. We're trying to slowly see what is the personhood that is going to unfold. Okay. And then after it says that, it makes a variation in the Hebrew that man, that person, Aishahu, is going to go back. It's going to go from the general to the specific and back to the general. That kind of a person, he had cultivated virtues. After we know that he lives on the earth and has a name, it doesn't tell us first that he's super rich, or that he gives charity and tithes. It tells us something about his character. So it says, and this is the key term, the first thing. And I'm going to this one of the few terms I'll put on. There'll be two key terms, but the first, he's called at the very beginning, Tam. So here in the JKS translation, they blames. Hi, baby. Shenlin says innocent. Tam has this blend between, it's not simple-mindedness, but it's a person who has a kind of purity. When it says in Deuteronomy to be tamim with God, it says you don't futz around and fool around with idols just in case they work in the afternoon. Right? You take a path. You take it with a certain kind of integrity. So he's not a simple guy. He's a person with a certain kind of inner coherence, you might say, right? You're not born that way. not born upright. Stand up, but you're not upright. That's a moral term. You reach into something higher. That's what the term upright is, a powerful metaphor. Stand up, but you're upright. It's a very different metaphor. You're on the ground, you might be downtrodden, but you're upright. You look ahead, look around. There's something in your head. You're not just a goat, which just bumbles around. Be upright. There's something going on in your head that makes you upright. See. Right? And he's God-fearing. It doesn't say he loves God. And he turns from evil. So somehow turning from evil is different from being upright. Right? We're not meant to understand any of these things as synonyms. I don't think. So we're reading very slowly. You're not just moving along this simple, once upon a time, Goldilocks and 3 bears, and then into the bar, Right? We're meant to pause. So he's God-fearing as a matter of him being upright in time. I don't know what it means here. Some form of reverential disposition. Doesn't mean he's afraid of God. Maybe God is a real frightening spook and power. And maybe that's how the friends will understand you have to really have fear of heaven. Because God is powerful. But we don't know yet what the theological sense of being Yoreh Elohim is. And he's Yoreh Elohim, because it's not the Israelite God. He fears God. Right? He has a reverential disposition towards heaven. Which means, if I'm reading it straight off, he's upright in the sense that he has character. He's not humble in the sense that he goes around groveling, but he knows his perspective. Right? So to be upright means to have a certain relationship laterally with persons, he's not overburdening, he has a yashar, he's upright with them, and straightforward. Right? There's something about human reciprocity that seems to be a moral term, not just a religious category. But he also lives in the context of theological perspective. He has a reverential disposition. He's not, to be fearful here is not the tremendum that we talked about last time. It's not this awesome, frightening, inconceivable, nameless, powerful God. But he has a sense of proportion. God's in heaven, he's on earth. On earth you do acts of religious obedience and moral actions. Two fundamental dispositions. I act in a certain way towards God, acknowledging my proportion. I act in a certain way with persons, acknowledging my relationships. Right? So and it's also interesting that the active verb is that he departs from evil. So it doesn't say he does good and departs from evil. He departs from evil. He's upright and he departs from evil. Now, how all those things meld, we can't know, obviously. But it doesn't say he does good and departs from evil. It means that one aspect of his perspective on life is not to enhance the bad. It's already there. There are possibilities of the bad. And he keeps himself away from that. This is not a simple world. Right? Look at all what we're trying to get at. It's not a simple world. It's implied that there is Ra there, there's evil. We don't have to be told where it comes from. It's there, right? You cheat the grocer, there's a potential of evil there, right? It's all there as a potential. He doesn't get into that stuff. So he has some form of consciousness of where he's not going to go. We're learning a lot about this guy, Joe, from a theological point of view. So, right? He's a certain kind of a person. So he also has a family. So he's and he has possessions. So he has an inner disposition of righteousness, a certain religious disposition of reverence. He has family, persons, and he has things, and things, right? And it spells it out in ancient terms. Lots of camels and stuff like that. Doesn't have a Lamborghini, but he has a camel. And he's wealthier than any person in the East. Doesn't say anything that he did these things to get that, or that God gave him that because he was good. We don't know anything like that. You can't get inside of his head. The narrative doesn't allow us to say anything about that, what was going on in his head. Now the next part of the narrative gets us a little bit more into his head. Because it wants us to hear this kind of a guy. So now look at the language.
Can I just add one?
Yeah, please.
It does seem though that at the end where he mentions that, perhaps my children have sinned and, committed blasphemy in their thoughts, it seems like that is a certain sort of anxiety and almost a little bit of maybe a causality of, if they are doing these things, I have some control over that evil and,
I agree, and that's what we're going to do in this paragraph. I agree, I absolutely agree. In other words, it's going to take us into that complication. That first scene we wouldn't know anything about that, right? Now the narrator is going to get us into his head a little bit. So it's going to tell us what? So just as we hear. So it says that they used to go around and make religious feasts and have family hoedowns. They all used to get together and had a big grill in the backyard, the stoop, and they all came around every Sunday afternoon. Didn't get up till early the next morning and went to Alice's restaurant. And then they would go around with this ritual. And Job, there in verse 5, how does he translate here? So when the feast days were over, he would tell them to sanctify themselves and make burnt offerings for each of them. And he says, perhaps they screwed up. I'm going to cut up with them. I'm a good dad. I'll tell them what they need to do. Did you say your prayers? Did you sanctify yourself? Right? I'm not gonna let go of my parental responsibilities, even though you're married and have kids. I'm a helicopter kind of joke. Calling you on my cell phone. Did you sanctify yourself today? Right? Are you good with God? All right. So, and he was thinking, maybe they sinned and blasphemed in their thoughts. That's what Job was doing. So Job, he takes care of himself, he trusts himself. He is not completely trusting of his kids. And at what level does he have doubt? The doubt is between the inner and the outer. The doubt is the inner and the outer. But you look under the anxiety. So now we're learning something more. They're doing the external actions, but maybe they don't have inner integrity. And they say all kinds of raunchy things about God in their minds. Like, if I do this, he'll give me all kinds of candy, get my Snicker bar, God's the dispenser of Snicker bars and all these things. And somehow it's kind of cursing. Right? And the biblical text uses a very interesting euphemism. It says, "V'erchu Elohim b'levavam." So literally it means they bless God in their hearts, but it's a euphemism for cursing. So we're already brought in by the double entendre of the euphemism to moral and religious deceit. You say one thing and you think you do one thing and you think another. You say it one way and you really have a different intention in your heart. So Job is a different kind of a guy. We're already now, he's a person who wants integrity between the inner and the outer. We see that because that's his anxiety and his worry. He wants observance, but he wants it to come from a clean place. Right? So we're already presented with a Job who has a clean heart. Right? However we would understand it, right? He's got a clean heart. He wants integrity. But he's aware that people live deceptively. And it could even be his kids. His very pious Orthodox kids. Right? They're doing the socially right thing, and they really are blasphemers.
Does he have a clean heart if he's suspicious of his children?
Fair enough. He wants integrity. He wants integrity. He doesn't want things just to be. He wants his kids. Maybe he has a sense that God knows if you do it with a gap in your mind, and he doesn't want God to be angry. But why would he want to do that? maybe they bless God. He's trying to stop the bleeding there somewhere. Right? So then it goes, and then the text ends with that thing. This is what Job always used to do. Right? This is his way in the world. This is what a Job character is like. He cares for himself, cares for others. He's concerned that people have a false consciousness. And he doesn't reprove them directly, but he tries to kind of do the ritual repair work. Right? That would ring a bell to the reader in antiquity. It's supposed to ring some kind of a bell for us. So then we have the beginning of the disaster. So let's just read this first part of 6 to 12, and then we're going to jump to some of the responses. So let's just have the first of these scenes of the Satan. Who'd like to read that? Yeah. You want to read it? Great.
One day, the angels came to...
Or the divine beings, sorry, they're not a Satan.
One day, the divine beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it." God continued. Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil."
Yeah. God already read the first verse. Just kidding.
Then the Lord said to Satan, "Does Job fear God for nothing?" Satan replied. "Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You've blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face."
That's the same term that was used before. He will bless you as an euphemism for cursing. Okay?
The Lord said to Satan, "Very well then, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger."
Okay. So, where are we at? Anybody want to help me here? Where are we at? We have shifted from earth to heaven. Right? Right? The scene, as it will be several times, right? The scene is now somewhere else in the heavenly court. The B'nai Elohim are sort of the divine courtiers. Right? Among whom is the super sleuth detective, provocateur, guy who's checking it out. Right? He's the tattletale. Checking the earth out, see who's doing what. Okay? That's the way Providence seems to be working here. He's an agent of divine mind, providence, whatever, however you want to say it. But it's persona, okay? So he's an independent dimension of that inquiry. Everything is seen. Everything is checked out. Right? There is a providential agency snooping around. You're not sitting. And so he's going around. The play on his name, Satan, is also Lashut. He goes around. He's a go-around kind of guy. He sneaks around. Playing on his name. And when he comes to God says, "Have you sort of taken note of my servant Job? He's super duper kind of guy. all the virtues. Right? All the virtues. And Satan then raises the second key issue. The counterpoint to being Tom is the question, Hachinam. It's a question. Is it for nothing that he fears God? Right? So now this disposition is included in his mode of behavior. It's not just a reverential disposition. It includes, perhaps, what we're already beginning to see, some kind of anxiety and nervousness of getting it right. Right? And this is that first question. This is the core question. Does a person serve God chinam, for no benefit? Because he says, the Satan says, you protect him with everything. He's got, all kinds of airbags. Everywhere he goes, an airbag blows up, and he can't get hurt. He's got airbags. Goes this way, an airbag pops up. Goes that way, an airbag pops up. It's all soft. He's surrounded by airbags. And not only that, it says, Ba'ado uba'ad beito ba'ad kol asher lo. Everything around him, his body, his family, everything he has, airbags. You bump into nothing. You're protecting him. So, do you think he's serving God for nothing? He's serving God for airbags. Right? He doesn't want to be hurt. He's not just doing it. He's got ulterior motives. We now have a sense that Job, at least the way Satan is raising it, you think this is purity? This is utilitarian. Utilitarian religiosity. I do it for what it gets me. I talk nicely to you, so you will share something with me. Don't do anything on its own. Does a person act with pure integrity? That's the Satan's question. It goes to the heart of the human soul. Why do you do things? Why do you do things? Because you're trying to live in a world of airbags. You don't want pain. You don't want suffering. You want your kids around you to give you this big clam bake every Sunday. Right? Bring all the Budweiser that's needed. Right? You took it away. You think he's going to talk this way? So already the text is beginning to unravel. It's unraveling for us, not the Job. It's unraveling in our heads. We, the reader, are already thinking thoughts we never thought before through this text. Why does a person do things? Can a person be upright externally and just be a real grubber on the inside? How much would you do so that you won't have pain? How much would you lie and go through the motions? how much would you compromise? Curse God in your heart, right? How much would you really cheat on it so that you won't get hurt? Call it something right. Because at the ground level, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about pain, loss, and the airbag is food, health, peace, all having your kids around you for the second and the third generation, and having grandkids, and having camels, right? So we're being forced theologically back to the ground. We as the reader. Satan is talking to God when he's talking to us. He's talking to God because God is going to allow this. God in heaven is allowing this. Okay? Go ahead. He said, did you pay attention to my Job? He said, you kidding me? He's a deceiver. So God says, okay, stick it to him, but don't hurt him personally. Begin to take things away from him. Right? So then it happens. Right? Then someone punctures the airbags. Slam. Bangs his head on the dash. Then he gets a crack in the head. And he gets a this. And he gets a that. Right? And from a narrative point of view, we're brought into this in this successive way. Right? That goes after the kids first. Right? Kids. Sitting and eating and having a grand old time. And all of a sudden, things begin to fall apart. Just like that. God lets the Satan let the air out of the bag. Right? So the donkeys and the asses and the enemies and the storm. So this evil are tests. The evil here are tests allowed by the sovereign God through his agent, Mr. Satan. You can do it. Right? I'm going to give you the limit. Right? Setting up the condition. Just this far. So he's setting this up, all of this. And each time a messenger comes and says, I'm the sole survivor. I'm the sole survivor. I'm the witness to the horror. And then we jump down to verse 20. So notice where we have, this was the first scene. One thing after another. Home, family, possessions. Because the narrator knows something that we know we don't. We're not. So you say, where is the core of your personality? Where's the core of your personality? Is it in conscience and integrity? Or do you have this kind of corporate personality? I am my camel. I am my big house. I am my food. I am my villa. I have lots of kids. You don't. Right? I have 500 she-asses. You only have he-asses. Right? So I'm big with things. So that's part of this issue. Where is the core? And if you took all that other stuff away, is he empty on the inside and just blaspheme? Or he has a core? You and I have to think about it. So now we have verse 20, 21, and 22. So we have this first moment of crisis. And we're going to see, what does Job do in this primordial moment of loss that has come to him with a series of whacks of the messenger? There's a report, and the report has to keep coming. This is a little cognitive dissonance, right? This, and only I am, right? So it's accumulating. He doesn't respond to the first thing. Somehow it's the climax. Maybe it's because he just couldn't get it right. Everything, right, is building up. Loss and loss and loss. And then finally, the house collapses. And only I am left to tell you. So in a certain sense, only Job is left to hear it. Right? And so now we have our first case being thrown back down to the human. He's thrown back down from being a person with donkeys and asses and family and religious rituals, all the things that give his life meaning and order. And now it's all gone. And what's striking here is the phrase. So Job arose. I'm going to just translate it for them. You can look on your translation. I'm on verse 20. I'm going to do it as literally as possible. So Job arose in consequence of what just took place. And he ripped his garment. And he shaved his head. And he fell on the ground. And he prostrated himself. And then he said something. So at the very beginning, there are no words. There is a kind of mimesis of acting out utter loss. There are only actions. You rip your clothes that had covered you. There's a tear in the wound of your heart that you express in your clothes. You shave your head here in public the way you did before. You're like a little, you don't look like a person anymore. You're on the ground. You're no longer standing upright. You are what has happened to you. You are just a body on the ground with ripped clothes and a shaven head. So this is the first response of the primal shudder of horror. He doesn't at first start elaborating theology. He becomes a mourner in gesture. He's being brought to some kind of core. This being a form of the tremendum. Something, an abyss has opened up. And his language, which comes last, it's not a prayer. It's some kind of reawakening of consciousness of the mortal self, not the ritual self. These rituals are spontaneous. He's not going from feast day to feast day, not having all the things that he's worried about in his ritual consciousness. He has a first consciousness of the primordiality of the human. I was born naked. I'm going to die naked. Right? I came from my mother's womb with nothing. And I'm going to go back to the earth, the womb of the earth with nothing. And that's what he's acted out. He's acted out his stripping. It's a mental and physical and emotional stripping. And then he says this phrase, which I want to come back to, which Kierkegaard picks up onto. Because now he raises his thoughts from birth and death as the most primary. You're born without consciousness and naked. You die without consciousness and you're naked. You're just, that's what you are. All this other stuff in between. You're feeling, being calm, upright, and all this. But between those two things, how does that affect your consciousness, knowing that? So we also want to ask ourselves, or at least I'm asking myself the question, did he come to that realization just now in deep sorrow? Or did he know this? Did he know this? Or is that a modern question? That part of my spiritual and emotional growth is to be aware that I'm mortal. And I'm going to try to do something of value in that space. Is that just a modern question? Does it have an ancient correlate? That somehow, clearly it's an issue that the writer of Job knows, so it's a true statement. Right? But we are left to wonder how you and I, as moderns, and Job as an ancient, did that moment now make him aware of this? And he is expressing in terms which are not yet religious terms, they're just anthropological terms. The second statement might be a little more religious. The first statement is just anthropological. My mother I was suckled there in a womb and came forth, and then I'm going to die and be shoveled into the ground naked without my camels. Or does he have this, or are we supposed to think, I'm going to keep that in mind, and I'll live a life with that consciousness of limits? Is that just a more modern question? And then he reformulates this in religious terms. And now he uses one of the biblical and Jewish terms for God. He doesn't say Elohim. He uses the tetragram, Yahweh. So obviously, the narrator is speaking to the Israel leader. Bingo, for the first time. The Lord is given, and the Lord is taken. So now somehow, there's an expansion of consciousness. And that expanded consciousness says that birth is a gift of God, and death is taken, life is taken by God. It's not just a natural event. Now, he's not giving us high theology here. So don't read this into your own catechism or whatever. He's not giving us theological, high-minded statements. He's saying that the birth in the womb and the death have a deeper gift and removal of that gift. And that the things that happen in the world come from God. That's all he's saying. It says nothing about whether he deserved it and whether God did justly with what God has just done. Notice that. He just says, God gives and God takes. And then he says, may the name of the Lord be blessed. Now, for the first time, that term is not used in this. It doesn't mean curse. He praises God for life and death, for gift and loss. He magnifies the name of God at the time of loss. So what does Kierkegaard say on this? Remind me.
He says that Job doesn't first recognize the loss that's happened. He first recognizes the gift that was.
Yeah, he said you would have expected if he would have formulated it differently. But learning something about the nature of Job, he says, by the way he talks. The ordinary person would have said, God has taken. Because that's that first experience. But he says, had Job said that, he would have fallen into the abyss of despair. His whole mind would have been lost. We're not minimizing loss. But had this Job that we're learning something about said, the Lord has taken, and then the Lord has given. In other words, I pull back in my recognition of loss, and then I know that I had also been given, he would have been a different person. So he says, what does it mean when he says it's the other way around? What does Kierkegaard say? Very, whether it's true or not, but it's a very interesting statement. Gets you thinking. What do you say?
He appreciates what he has been given before this occurred.
Right.
He was,
His heart is ultimately, but in the first sense, his heart is expanded. His heart is expanded to the gifts of life. Whether this is the most normal or sensible response, or whether this is the response of a person who has cultivated a lifetime of religious practice. Right? In other words, in a certain sense, Kierkegaard is raising the question that when that happens, you may also respond in terms of how you cultivated your inner life. I think it's part of what Kierkegaard is making us say. Some people, they just fall into the hole and they wallow in the abyss. It's been taken away from you. Right? It's a free fall, a long free fall, because there's no bottom. God has taken it away. Or is there another kind of person who has spent a lifetime of religious ritual and practice and reverential consciousness and is aware of gift? So he's not necessarily saying, I got gift because I was good, because I deserved it. But I have the gift of grace. In other words, there's something here which Christian terms we use as grace. Jews, the term chesed has the same quality, but it means it's given to me. It's given to me. By God. Because God is the agent of gift in this text. Right? Just like God is the agent of life in the earth that I look at. That's not big theology, but it's powerful. God is giver and gift. So perhaps all of that was in his mind. He doesn't say, how could God do this to me in this first instance, right? How could God do this to me? I was a good servant. That is not stated in the text. He somehow retrieves that deep sense that loss is predicated on having had a gift. And he's able to bring that to his consciousness in the context of mourning. Right? That's an amazing thing. Whether that is normal, I leave to you. Whether you have to really spend a lifetime of serious religious thinking to get there and cultivate the notion of gratitude. So here we have two conflicting primary feelings: gratitude and loss. Something more basic, right? And the narrator is telling us in the voice of Job you don't understand loss unless you first have a sense of gratitude and thanks for what you have. Otherwise, you are just so self-centered. Right? Because if I just said I lost it, I'm stuck in my little head. I lost it. It's taken from me. But if I start with this other consciousness of gratitude, of gift, I didn't deserve anything. That's that language of grace. Right? But don't fill it in with your religious language. But that's the gratitude. I have something God has given. And that's I have the gift of life. I wouldn't know death, but I didn't know the gift of life. Right? So it's very interesting the way this narrative is talking about what it means to be a religious personality. Right? He's not accusing God of anything. He says, may the name of the Lord be blessed for life and loss. God gives and God takes. That's a reverential consciousness. In the context of gratitude and mourning are within this context of a reverential consciousness. And then the narrator adds a very interesting phrase. Because we already have in the back of our heads of what he was afraid his kids had done, right? They had bad thoughts. So the narrator is concerned with helping you realize that this is not formal claptrap. This is stated with integrity. He says, in all of this took place, and all the things that he said, Job didn't sin. And he didn't blaspheme or say anything negative of God. The word is give a tifla, so it's punning on the word of prayer, but he said nothing despising of God. Right? So that's this first level. We're going to see, so the first level we see is the primary shudder of a mourning ritual. And the first statement is so close to it. I'm just a naked soul. And then the religious mindset tries to overcome that primary physicality. And it reformulates that. And he spoke the truth from his heart. That's what the narrator said. And then the thing goes on again. Right? And Satan wants to do this again. He says, the real thing, God, is people will say all kinds of things until it hits them in their flesh. They can make all kinds of statements in mourning when they lose stuff. So the first statement was, it seems that he can divest himself of all need. Right? It's an act of detachment, divestment. He can give it up and bless God. And then Satan is that thing in your head that asks that other question. But what if it happened to him directly? Would he still talk that way? Right? The Satan is that provocative question to God, which is a provocative question in your mind the narrator is putting in. That's the Satan in the head. So would you do the same if it happened to you? Right? It's okay. I love my kids, I love my donkeys, I love my house. Maybe I'll get an insurance policy and I can rebuild. But what if it happens to me? Right? If I lose my leg, I can't grow a new leg. Right? If I lose my eye, I can't grow a new eye. So what if it happens to you? Right? Then what do you say? What do you do? So he's smitten with this horrible disease. Some kind of horrible boil, whatever it is. He's just an unrecognizable monster. His body is not a body. He lives in a body that's not a normal body. It's a sick body. Really sick. Right? So it's getting at that from this point of view. Illness in the most radical sense. How does that change his consciousness? Right? So the Satan smites Job with a horrible skin cancer. Horrible. From his head to foot. This is absolute illness. Horrible to look at, boils that are horrible to smell, a feeling that's horrible to endure on the inside. Right? And he becomes like an animal. Takes a potsherd and he scrapes away his boils. Right? Doctors don't even want to come near. He scrapes it. And he sits on the earth. So just feel this. This is the abyss that his body has now gone to. Right? There's no healing. He sits there scraping his body. So his wife comes along. She's a new voice. She becomes another perspective. She has remained by his side, but it's pretty quiet still. So who is his wife? Is it a different part of his head? Like Eve may be a different part of Adam's head? Is she a real person? Does she represent something real inside his head, or is this another form of social language? Because she says, how long are you going to be calm? I mean, there are limits, Job. You haven't opened your mouth. There are limits, she says. She is the voice that says there are limits. There are limits to outrage. Curse God and die. She's now saying we're blessed. Curse God and die. Get it over with. Right? Say damn you and get it over with. Right? Say, that's what you're thinking, right? Curse. God will smite you, and it's over. You don't have to play games here. What are you holding on to your integrity for? What is its social issue now? Is there anything to have a question? So she's saying to Job, all you have is this little insideness of integrity called tongue. It's inside you. You're keeping yourself quiet, keeping your mouth shut. You first bless God's name, now curse God. Let something else come out of your mouth, and then it's over. You don't have to, right? So you're saying that there's a limit to this. And his answer, he says, you damn idiot. Right? You talk like a fool. He speaks to that voice, whether that voice that represents another social voice in the world. It's something that's deeply intimate with him, that share life with him. Right? That's in his head, but outside his head. That's the mother of his children. Right? And she's saying it because she loves him. Right? She's saying it because she loves him. She's not just a jerko, she loves him. What's left for you, Job? Just curse it and get it done. She's speaking as a loved one who's giving comfort to her sick husband. And he says, this is the most stupid thing I've ever heard. To accept good and not from God, and not accept evil or bad, and live innocent with his mouth. We don't know what he's saying in his head. We don't know what's going on in his head yet, or his heart, but he didn't say anything wrong with his mouth yet. So, in a certain sense, we have a deeper theological glossing of that first statement. Notice that there are a series of progressions in the response to suffering. That first was that physical falling on the ground. The second was to say, I'm just naked. Always was, always will be. That's my mortality. And then he gets it to a little higher theological level and says, we have received and we lose. God, bless the name of the Lord. And now something of anger rises in him when he is told there's a limit to internal integrity. Because he's angry. There's some kind of pushback against that statement, even by a loved one. I can't bear watching you suffer. So say, damn you, and die. Right? And he says, I can't do that. I can't do that. And he ratchets up the language from God giving and taking to God gives the good and God gives the bad. It all comes from God. This is some kind of an astonishing theological place that he's at. Right? This is an astonishing place. So it says he didn't sin with his lips. And the reader just helps us say, just like in the last one it says, he didn't say, Tifla didn't say the wrong thing to Elohim in verse 122. Now, that whole issue of the inner and the outer, he didn't yet curse with his lips. But something changed in his head that's going to now come out in chapter 3. The narrator is very, very smart. He's preparing us for chapter 3. Something is going on inside Job's head, maybe. That's not yet overstep the bounds of religious propriety on the outside. And then the text closes in this very interesting way that in a certain sense mirrors his first response. So now we have the notion of friendship. Or to put differently, we had a messenger who gives bad news. We had the wife who is trying to be a helper. And now we have another level at the human level, which only another human can do, to give condolence and consolation. The sufferer can do certain things, but only a friend or a loved one can give condolence and consolation. How do you give condolence and consolation to something horrible? You send a Hallmark card? No words will express my grief. Smell the roses. Okay? What do you do? What is the notion of condolence? That's theological. That's anthropological. That touches the ground level. Condolence. Is there anything more primary when a person comes to another suffering person? Right? That's it's a primary act of friendship, of care. Means that we're co-carers in the world. Right? Right? Condolence is at one level, but you do this with a friend who said, I got a bad phone call, I had a bad dream. There are lots of things that happen short of death that require condolence. Right? That require you to be a caretaker for another person. Right? A person who gives condolence is a caretaker who says, I have a responsibility of care not to God, but to my fellow person. This is theology before theology. I'm a co-liver on the earth with another person. So these guys come. They hear the rumor of all the horror that has taken place to the church. So what do? They first hear the report. Then they get off the dime. They leave their house. They go to the place of suffering. They leave each person their house. Eliphaz, the Temanite, Bildad, the Shuhite, Zophar, the Naamatite. They came together to rock and mourn Rachel and give him consolation. When they see him with their eyes, they don't recognize him. This is a human being. This was our friend Job. And they do what Job did at the beginning. They screech. They raise their voice and scream. Holy cow. God Almighty. And they cry. And they rip their garments. And they throw sand upon them. and they sit there, don't say a word, because they see how enormous the pain. That's consolation. They sit with him in the dirt and keep silent. Again, this issue of what is appropriate to say. Sometimes you say a certain word of confession, sometimes you just keep quiet. So they imitate him in that morning moment. And it's at that point that we have to be architects and be able to go on. It creates this closure. Job has maintained his integrity. Friendship has provided care. Sometimes silence is greater than praise. Mortals can comfort mortals. And a human being can keep their life in perspective, which is part of what Job is trying to do. That's a lot. It's a lot. And next week, he's going to scream. So we have to feel that coming up this whole week. Because now he's going to articulate in human language his verbal response to horror. The narrator has taken us on an incredible journey. Incredible space of reflection. You can't come to the end of chapter 2 and be the same person. All kinds of new stuff are stuck in your head and your heart. And that's what you have to hold on to as you move forward. See you next week.